Page 1. The Mind-Body Problem, Mario Bunge. A Psychobiological Approach. Preface. From time immemorial people have grown accustomed to accounting for their behavior and their subjective experience in terms of a soul or mind and its putative properties. Thus they say things like I have X on my mind, I am of two minds about Y, may her soul rest in peace, and upon my soul. Then, at the beginning of our century, people were told by eminent psychologists and neurophysiologists that all talk of mind was nonscientific, a mere remnant of primitive superstition. They were asked to give up, not only the theological notion of an immaterial and immortal soul, but also the very ideas of mental abilities, dispositions, states, and events. And some of them were successfully trained to speak only of observable facts, whether movements of the whole animal, or of some of their parts. This ban on the concept of mind paralyzed some philosophers, particularly those with positivistic leanings, since, after all, they had inspired the behaviorist movement. But others went on writing about minds, intentions, mental images, and the like. This was to be expected, for most philosophers do not listen to scientists. In the meantime the eminent Jean Piaget, oblivious of behaviorist prohibitions, went on investigating the emergence and growth of mental abilities in children and adolescents. 2 decades later another equally influential rebellion spread. Donald Hebb stated that neuron assemblies may not only detect and process external stimuli but may also ideate. And he said loudly that human psychology is about the mind. Shortly thereafter the linguist Noam Chomsky launched a direct attack on mindless psychology without, unfortunately, rescuing the nervous system. This signaled the beginning of the end of the long and boring behaviorist night. The concept of mind is now back, and probably for good. Not only psychologists and philosophers but also some neurophysiologists dare now write about it. Even ethologists are discovering that animals other than men can become aware of what they do, and try to explain some of their behavior on the assumption that they have mental abilities. Is this comeback of the concept of mind a mere return of the old theological idea of an immaterial and possibly indurable entity hovering above the brain and surviving the dissolution of the latter? In some cases it is. To be sure, such a resurrection is of no great help to science, even though we do need the idea of an idea. That idea need not be idealistic, nay it cannot be if it is to harmonize with science. Because science deals with concrete entities only, because it acknowledges only properties of such entities rather than properties in themselves, it has no use for properties and changes thereof that fail to be properties or changes of some concrete entity or other, be it atom or neuron, brain or galaxy. There is no harm in speaking of mental states or events provided we do not assign them to an immaterial, unchangeable, and inscrutable entity, but identify them instead with states or events of the brain. This hypothesis, that mind is a collection of brain functions, is as old as it is half-baked. It has inspired philosophers, physiological psychologists, and neurophysiologists, but it has not yet been formulated as a well-organized theory. Unless it be developed into a theory proper, it is but a poor substitute for the myth of the soul. It is certainly more fruitful than the latter, which is actually barren at its best, yet so far it has been only an embryonic conjecture. The main goal of this book is to try to transform that view, that is, that mind is a set of brain activities, into a theoretical framework, and moreover one compatible with the latest results obtained by neurophysiologists and psychologists, and capable of inspiring further advances in their research. Neurophysiology is necessary but not sufficient, for it tends to discard psychological categories such as those of purpose and thought. And psychology, though equally necessary, is insufficient as well unless it is physiological, for it tends to forget about the nervous system, that is the constructive part of this book. This work has also a polemical side. Indeed, it intends to show that the idea of a separate mental entity is not only unwarranted by the available data and the existing psychological models, but collides head-on with the most fundamental ideas of all modern science and is thus a stumbling block to progress. Data gatherers may care little for either aspect of this book, the theoretical or the critical. But data gathering, though a part of scientific research, is not all of it. As Henri Poincaré copyright noted long ago, science is not a heap of facts but an edifice built of facts and hypotheses, and criticism, far from being alien to science, is the salt of science. This holds particularly with regard to problems, such as that of the nature of mind, which are not only scientific but also philosophical and ideological. In writing this book I have benefited from exchanges with a number of gifted students as well as with Professors Dalberg, Psychology, McGill, Theodore H. Bullock, Neurosciences, California, SD, Victor H. Denenberg, Biobehavioral Sciences, Connecticut, Jose A. Copyright Luis Diaz, Investigaciones Biome Copyright Dikes, UNM, Bernardo Dubrovsky, Psychiatry, McGill, Augusto Fern A. Desguardiola, Instituto Nacional de Neurologia y Neurocirugía, M. Copyright Zico, DF, Rodolfo Lin A. S, Physiology and Biophysics, New Medical Center, Michel Paradis, Linguistics, McGill, Rodolfo P. A. Copyright Tres Pascual, Instituto de Física, UNM, Harold Pinsker, University of Texas Medical Branch, Pablo Rudiman, Centro de Estudios Avanzados del IPN, Paul Juan Gardner, Institute fa 1/4 R Philosophy, Université Currency T Salzburg, and F. Eugene Yates, Biome Copyright Dickel Engineering, University of Southern California. I am also grateful to my father, Augusto Bunge, M.D., 1877 to 1943, for having instilled in me a naturalistic, evolutionary, and science-oriented worldview. Last, but not least, I am indebted to my childhood playmates the dachshund Daki, the Belgian shepherd Rip, and the monkey Titi, for having taught me that man is not alone in having a mind. Mario Bunge. Introduction. This book deals with one of the oldest, most intriguing, and most difficult of all the problems belonging in the intersection of science and philosophy, namely the so-called mind-body problem. This is the system of ancient questions about the nature of the mental and its relations to the bodily. Here are some of the problems belonging to the mind-body problem circle. Are mind and body two separate entities? If so, how are they held together in the living organism? How do they get in touch in the beginning, how do they fly asunder at the end, and what becomes of the mind after the breakdown of the body? How do the two entities manage to function synchronically? What does it mean to say that mental states have neural correlates? Do these entities interact, and if so how? And which if any has the upper hand? If, on the other hand, mind and body are not different entities, is the mind corporeal? Or is it the other way around, namely is the body a form of the mind? Or is each a manifestation of a single, neutral, underlying and accessible substance? In either case, what is mind? A thing, a collection of states of a thing, a set of events in the thing or nothing at all? And whatever it is it just physical or is it something more? And in the latter case, that is, if mind is emergent relative to the physical level, or can it be explained in a scientific manner, or can it be described only in ordinary language? The mind-body problem is notoriously a hard nut to crack, surely even more so than the problem of matter, so much so that some scientists and philosophers despair of it being soluble at all. We submit that the problem, though tough, is soluble, and shall outline a solution to it in this work. But before doing so we shall have to do some philosophical scouting and conceptual cleansing, because part of the problem is that it is usually formulated in inadequate terms, and namely in those of ordinary language. These are inadequate not only because ordinary language is imprecise and poor, but also because the European languages are loaded with a preconceived solution to the problem, namely psychophysical dualism, or the doctrine that mind and body are separate entities. To begin with, the very expression mind-body problem suggests that mind and body are two entities on the same footing, like partners in a common enterprise. Yet we do not speak of the motion-body problem in mechanics, or of the reaction-substance problem in chemistry, or of the digestion-digestive tract problem in physiology, or of the unemployment-unemployed problem in sociology. We do speak, on the other hand, of the motion of bodies, the digestive function of the digestive tract, and so on. We do not reify properties, states, or events except when it comes to the properties, states, and events of the nervous system. It is imperative that we close this gap that keeps the study of mind a scientific anomaly. We propose to do so by abandoning ordinary language and adopting instead the state-space language, which is mathematically precise and is shared by science and scientific philosophy. A first difficulty with the so-called mind-body problem is, then, that it is usually couched in ordinary language, to the point that even linguistic philosophers, who do not have the least scientific curiosity, feel free to speculate about it. Cf. The Essays in Philosophical Psychology by Wittgenstein and his followers, notably Anscombe, Austin, Pears, and Wisdom, none of whom pays any attention to physiological or to mathematical psychology. A second difficulty is the extreme youth of neuroscience. Recall that Ram-tilde-cubed and Wycogel's neuronal hypothesis of the brain is less than 1 century old and was generally ignored until half a century ago. There were important sporadic discoveries in earlier times, starting with Hippocrates' hypotheses that the brain rather than the heart or the liver is the organ of emotion and thought, and that epilepsy is a brain disorder. However, it is only in recent years that a concerted attack at all levels has been launched, in particular through the neurosciences research program. See, for example, Worden et al., 1975. A third difficulty is that, far from being a strictly scientific problem, ours is also a philosophical one. In fact, it is a traditional metaphysical problem and one that has aroused the greatest passion, hence also the greatest caution for fear of repression. Moreover, the very formulation of the mind-body problem presupposes a number of ontological notions that are far from clear in traditional metaphysics, in particular those of substance, or matter, property, state, event, emergence, and level of organization. Thus any argument as to whether or not there is a mental substance, or whether or not there are mental states that fail to be brain states, calls for a prior elucidation of the general concepts of substance and state. For details on these concepts see Bunge, 1977a, fourth and last. Another reason for the backward state of research into the brain-mind problem is that it belongs not only to science and philosophy but also to ideology. Indeed, all religions and some political ideologies have a vested interest in the problem, and some even claim exclusive ownership. So, far from being interested in the investigation and discussion of the problem, they are anxious to have us accept their own ready-made solutions. In short, there have been many obstacles in the way of a scientific study of mind. Fortunately, some of these obstacles are disappearing rather quickly, and the science of mind is making great strides. In fact, 3 formerly separate currents are converging: neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. Over the past 2 decades, neurophysiologists have begun to study mental functions of neural systems. Physiological psychologists have started to disclose some of the neural mechanisms mediating our subserving behavior, and philosophers have begun to analyze some of the key concepts involved in the question and to overhaul the ancient doctrine that mental functions are a kind of bodily function. There is still a long way to go before maturity is attained, but the science of mind has finally got off the ground. This book will offer an examination of rival doctrines of mind as well as a general framework for building specific theories of mental abilities. Our framework will be as exact as possible, for we believe in clarity, particularly when dealing with tricky and controversial matters. Thus we shall not attempt to answer the question whether mind exists, without first defining the concept of mind. There has been enough obscurity on this point for thousands of years, partly because of the unwillingness of philosophers and theologians to state their theses with a minimum of clarity. But of course we shall not attempt to define every one of our terms, for this would result in circularity. We shall borrow some of them from biology and others from exact philosophy, and shall characterize our basic, undefined, concepts by means of postulates, or initial assumptions, the way it is done in the exact sciences. And in postulating, or assuming, as well as in defining, we shall attempt to lay bare the structure of our concepts. Thus brain properties will be represented by mathematical functions, brain states will be construed as values of lists of certain functions, and brain processes as sequences of such states. By proceeding in this way, rather than in the informal manner characteristic of almost the entire literature on the mind-body problem, we shall avoid obscurity and build a vigorous link with both mathematical neurobiology and exact philosophy. However, the mathematics will be kept to a minimum, and the reader uninterested in formalization will be able to skip the formulas and not, however, statements such as the mind of an animal is not an entity but a set composed of some of its brain processes. Page 10,